Hello everyone, it's me again. Tonight, when darkness has fallen and the outside world has fallen silent, I want to invite you to listen to a story. A story about old places, invisible fears, and the nagging feeling that we are never truly alone, even in our own homes. Find a comfortable place, close your eyes if you want, and let my voice lead you into the darkness. There are fears that do not need a specific form. They creep into your mind like a cold mist, starting from a vague feeling of insecurity, then gradually tightening their hold on you until breathing becomes difficult. My story begins in such a place that should have been a safe place, but instead became the source of a series of long haunted days. It's the attic of an old house I used to live in. I still remember the biting cold of that place. Not the usual cold of a rarely used space, but a cold that seemed to penetrate to the very bones, carrying with it a heavy, gloomy presence. There were times, especially on cold winter nights, when the attic was so cold that my breath froze into white clouds, hanging in the stagnant air in front of me. The only light was a weak ceiling light bulb, covered with a thick layer of dust, casting strange shadows on the dilapidated walls and old forgotten items. I went up there not out of curiosity, but out of an inexplicable urge, a feeling that something had to be stopped. The previous nights, the house had not been quiet. The sound of the wind whistling through the gaps sounded like wailing, and sometimes I swore I heard ghostly giggles, echoing from somewhere far away, but also very close. But the scariest were the sounds coming from above, from the attic. A rattling, dragging sound, as if something was moving slowly across the wooden floor. That night, fear reached its peak. While standing in the cold attic, trying to reassure myself that it was just the old house, I heard it. A very light shuffling sound, right behind me. It didn't sound like normal footsteps, but more like the sound of fingernails lightly scratching against wood. That sound made the blood in my body freeze. I stood motionless, not daring to turn my head. I just felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then a wind suddenly blew through, even though there were no windows open. The wind carried a strange stench, an oppressive mixture of damp mold and stagnant water. My eyes were stinging, tears flowed not because of sadness, but because of the unpleasant smell and rising fear. A wave of terror ran down my spine, an instinctive urge to run immediately. But there was something stronger than fear that held me back. It was the thought that I had to do something to stop this thing that was lurking in the darkness. In my hands was a hammer and a handful of long nails. I didn't know exactly what I was doing. I just knew that the trapdoor leading to the attic had to be tightly closed, permanently sealed. I turned around, facing the old trapdoor lying on the floor. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to act. I knelt down and placed the first nail in the edge of the door. My breathing was rapid, creating white smoke in the cold air. I raised the hammer, and the first strike rang out dryly in the silence. The sound seemed to echo throughout the attic, a strange echo that carried a defiant tone, as if I were confronting the darkness that surrounded me head-on. Each strike of the hammer was a heroic effort to fight the fear that was paralyzing me. The sound of metal hitting metal, the sound of wood cracking as the nail pierced through. I could feel that presence, the invisible force backing away reluctantly from my attempt to seal the entrance. I felt its rage, an invisible pressure weighing on the surrounding air. One nail after another. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead, ignoring the coldness of the attic. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. I drove each nail in deeper and more firmly, creating a temporary but resolute barrier. When the last nail was firmly in place, I felt a strange joy, a momentary surge of relief, but was immediately mixed with a dizzying feeling of rising fear. At that moment, my ears felt a strange pressure, as if the air was being compressed, and then a muffled pop sounded from the other side of the newly sealed trapdoor. And then, I thought I heard a whisper. It was faint but terrifyingly clear. Maybe that was my name, but distorted, stretched into a strange sound that sent chills down my spine. An uncontrollable trembling spread throughout my body. I didn't dare stay another second. Having completed my makeshift barricade, I hurriedly fled the attic, almost stumbling down the stairs in a panic. My heart pounded against my chest, so hard that I had to lean against the cold hallway wall to keep myself from collapsing. When I got downstairs, I realized how labored and rapid my breathing had become. The whole house seemed to be holding its breath with me. The air was thick and stuffy. But strangely, right after that extreme panic attack, a fragile, almost false, peace enveloped me. That night, I slept, but only for brief periods of uneasy rest. I still woke up many times. My body was drenched in cold sweat. My heart was still beating fast. But the house was noticeably quieter. The sound of the wind howling through the roof and the ghostly laughter seemed to have disappeared, or at least reduced to faint, distant whispers, as if they were no longer right inside the walls, but only lurking somewhere in the dark corners of my mind. For the next few days, I lived in a state of high alert, watching and waiting. Half of me feared that the ceiling boards would burst open on their own, or that terrible foul wind would blow again. But that didn't happen. The house maintained its relative silence. However, that peace is never complete. The nights are still disturbed. My dreams were still haunted by the oppressive darkness and the feeling of being constantly watched. But those experiences were less physical, less direct attack. Gradually, my appetite returned, and the constant gnawing anxiety that resided in my chest seemed to loosen its grip a little. I can exist in my own home without feeling the urge to run away immediately every time night falls. Still, every time I passed by the bottom of the stairs leading to the attic, a chill still ran down my spine. My skin felt goosebumps as memories of the cold, the scratching sound, and especially that distorted voice came rushing back. Many weeks have passed since the night I closed that trapdoor. I won't pretend that my life is completely back to normal. Not at all. Sometimes, the lights in the house still flicker inexplicably. Occasionally, my ears still catch the faint echoes of something running past, or a cold breeze passing through the walls with unknown origin. And sometimes, in those drowsy moments between sleep and wakefulness, I feel a cold blast of air passing by my ear, carrying a vague whisper that sounds a lot like my name, but that entity, or whatever resided in the attic, no longer forced itself back into my life with the same ferocious fury. It's like a caged animal, still there, still dangerous, but at least separated by a thin barrier. I still wonder if my actions were just delaying another inevitable encounter. The words in an old letter I happened to read from the previous owner are still engraved in my mind. It feeds your fears. In rare, quieter moments, I question my own memories. Have I exaggerated those experiences? Did isolation, stress, and an overactive imagination paint that scary picture? The possibility of a completely mundane, ordinary explanation is both a comfort and an embarrassment. How much more reassuring it would be to believe that I had simply imagined the whole ordeal out of extreme anxiety. But a deeper part of me, a part that felt the bone-chilling cold, that heard the scratching, that felt that invisible pressure, knew that what I felt was real. My skin actually got goosebumps in that attic. That wind actually blew the dusty boxes into the air. That invisible presence actually whispered my name. They are not illusions that I can easily dismiss. I never intend to open that trapdoor again. Whatever dwells between those walls, wherever that dark hallway leads, I would rather leave it sealed forever. Perhaps, as the letter said, it thrives when acknowledged, when nourished by that fearful curiosity, that instinctive urge that forces us to peek behind the curtain that hides the horrifying truth. If that is the case, then my best defense is to deny it, to refuse to give it that satisfaction. Yet every time the house groans in the night, every time the air in the room suddenly becomes unreasonably cold, I am reminded that the barriers I have erected may only be temporary. That oppressive weight has not completely disappeared. It is only sometimes subdued and restrained. Sometimes, I think I can feel it pacing on the other side, like something locked in a cage, biding its time, waiting for an opportunity. Even now, as I tell this story to you, that memory sends a shiver through my hands. I could feel my pulse quicken, my temples twitching with each heartbeat. I found myself suddenly looking up at the ceiling, half expecting to see a strange ripple in the wooden surface, or hear that creepy chuckle again. a nagging feeling of discomfort that refused to completely go away. I have had to accept that some scars never heal completely. That house, with all its hidden passages and disturbing secrets, changed me forever. I feel like I'm living on a fragile cliff, between normalcy and something different, something I still struggle to name or even understand. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth. Once you've opened the door to your deepest fears, you can never completely close it again. After that horrifying experience, I decided to move. I needed a fresh start, a place not haunted by cold memories and ghostly whispers. I found a house for rent in another town that looked normal, even boring. But sometimes, normalcy is just a thin cover that hides more unusual things. The air in this new house always felt a little stuffy, but one particular night, the stuffiness became almost unbearable. The moment I walked through the front door after a long day of work, an almost imperceptible chill enveloped me. It was like invisible icy fingers gently touching the back of my neck. My skin instantly prickled, and an indescribable feeling of uneasiness overtook me. The feeling that someone or something was watching me from just beyond my vision. I have lived in many rented houses before, but I have never felt such a persistent and uncomfortable atmosphere of insecurity. Even the silence in this house seemed unusual. It was not an empty silence, but seemed to be filled with faint echoes of things that could not be seen, movements that could not be heard. If I could go back in time and choose a different route, turning left instead of entering this house, I probably would have done so. But a strange mixture of morbid curiosity and inherent fear forced me to step deeper inside, uncovering secrets I should have left alone. I suppose it all started quite innocently. At first, I simply tried to get used to the new place, going through each room to orient myself and arrange furniture. The main floor isn't particularly noteworthy. Hardwood floors that creak under every step, bland cream walls, and a few bare shelves. The second floor is where the bedrooms are. My room is at the end of a narrow hallway, and at first glance it feels the most comfortable in the whole house. Even though I rented the house alone, the room felt strangely alive, as if the presence of the previous tenants was still lurking somewhere in the corners, in the air. There's something about that concept that makes me feel both strangely comforted and vaguely anxious. The real intrigue, the real obsession, began when I decided to venture down to the basement. It was a damp, dark place, lit only by a single round light bulb hanging overhead. Light bulbs buzzed and flickered continuously, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move and vibrate along the cold cement walls. The basement itself was a mess, a jumble of half-rotted cardboard boxes, dusty old furniture, and all sorts of random junk that must have accumulated over the years. I went down there only to find an extension cord. I remembered I had packed it somewhere. While rummaging through a pile of old things, my eyes happened to come across an old wooden chest, hidden behind a wooden table with one leg collapsed. The chest looked very old. The original bright paint had mostly faded. The wooden surface was scratched and stained with time. My heart beat a little faster. A feeling of curiosity mixed with a bad premonition arose as I used all my strength to pop off its heavy lid. There are no treasures or valuable antiques inside. Instead, I found a smaller, surprisingly well-crafted wooden box. The box's surface was carved with swirling designs, patterns so intricate that they seemed to move, undulating in the faint flickering light of the basement light bulb. When I carefully lifted its small lid, a distinct smell of old paper and dried glue entered my nose. Inside the little box was the thing that changed everything. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of old photos, brittle and yellow at the edges, carrying the musty smell of something long forgotten. The strange thing is, each photo seems to depict the same room. 4 walls, a bed, and a window, all arranged in an identical layout to my current bedroom on the second floor. At first, I tried to calm myself. Perhaps they are just images of a similarly constructed room in another house, or perhaps they are photos taken at different times in the past of this same room. But as I flipped through them, taking a closer look, I began to notice unmistakable details. The opening angle of the door, the special pattern on the window frame. There's no doubt about it. That's my bedroom, or at least an earlier version of it over the years. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the recognition of the room. It's what is shown in room through those photos. In these photos, the room is decorated in a strange and disturbing style. Bizarre, incomprehensible symbols, drawn or engraved with dark paint, are scattered across the walls. Some look like intricate spirals or small mazes. Others looked like ancient runes or letters distorted into a form of writing that I was completely unable to decipher. The bed in the photo, although shaped exactly like mine, was covered in an almost ceremonial-looking cloth, an unsettlingly dark color. The photo quality is quite poor, but the material of the fabric looks shiny and dark, as if it were dark wet satin. And then I saw it, a shape often lurking in the corner of the room in photographs. At first, in the oldest photos, it was just a blur and indistinct shadow. But as I looked through later photos, over time the shape became a little clearer, though never really understood or defined. It looked vaguely humanoid, tall and thin, but completely lacking a face. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a scary void where the expressive lines should be. In some photos, the silhouette's outline is bent at unnatural angles, almost broken, as if the camera had captured it at the very moment it was twitching or contorting in a grotesque way. My mouth was dry, and I realized I was gasping for air. My hands trembled. I put the photos aside, closed the lid of the small wooden box, and then almost immediately opened it again. Part of me hoped that I was just hallucinating, that the scary images were just a product of my imagination and the flashing lights in the basement. But no, the pictures remained the same, each one more disturbing and horrifying than the last. My heart was pounding so hard that the pounding in my ears drowned out all other sounds. I barely noticed the faint creaking sound coming from somewhere behind me in the dark basement. Maybe it's just the sound of the old wood of the house expanding, or a harmless noise from old pipes, or the sound of wind blowing through a certain gap. However, in that moment, amidst the pile of old things and ghostly photos, I felt absolutely certain that I was not alone in this basement. A sudden panic took over. I hastily gathered the photos, stuffed them in the box, slammed the lid of the trunk, and rushed out of the basement, not forgetting to slam the heavy door behind me. For hours afterward, I tried not to let my mind wander back to what I had seen. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the house and arranging things unconsciously, but my thoughts kept returning to the basement, back to those strange symbols, and especially to that faceless figure. My skin kept tingling with the memory of those images. I tried to reassure myself with reasonable explanations. It was just a strange box of old furniture from the previous owner. Maybe those photos aren't even real, maybe they're props from a play, a set piece for some spooky art project. But those explanations never really settled in my heart, never dispelled the deep feeling of insecurity. That night, I sat on my bed, trying to idly scroll through my phone to kill time, but my eyes kept unconsciously glued to the walls around me. I can't stop imagining the symbols from the photos hiding just beneath the cream paint, etched into the plaster, just waiting to be discovered. Sleep doesn't come easily. My breathing was shallow and rapid, my temples vibrating with each pounding of my heart. Finally, exhaustion pulled me to sleep, but it was a restless, restless sleep. In my dream, that faceless figure appeared again. It stood there, looking at me from the dark corner of the room. It didn't move, but I could feel it vibrating with a hostile energy, a malevolent presence. I woke up suddenly in the early hours of the morning, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding as if I had just run a marathon in a nightmare. The room was completely silent, but I still felt a heavy presence, just outside my vision, lurking in the remaining darkness. My breathing became ragged, cold sweat ran down my neck. It took me a long time and every last ounce of willpower for me to convince myself that it was just a bad dream. I tremblingly reached out to turn on the lamp next to the bed, my fingers shaking so much that I almost dropped the lamp from the nightstand. In the following days, I tried to suppress my curiosity, trying to forget about the photos and the damp basement. But the more I tried not to think about them, the more my discomfort increased. The urge that made me open that chest in the first place kept gnawing at my mind. I felt a strange, almost pathological need to see those symbols in the actual spatial context of my own room. This urge is both disturbing and irresistible. Finally, one evening, curiosity won out over fear. I decided to bring one of my oldest photos up to my bedroom. I told myself that perhaps if I saw clear evidence that the details in the photo did not match the current room, such as the wrong placement of that symbol, I could put this obsession aside. Walking up the narrow stairs to my bedroom that night felt like walking down a winding, endless path in a nightmare. Each step seemed heavier than the previous one, the air getting thicker and thicker. When I entered the room, my pulse was galloping like a racehorse. I clutched a photo in my hand. It was a photo where the walls seemed to be bleeding with strange swirling symbols. The bed in that picture looked exactly like my bed in appearance, although in the photo the bed cover looked tattered and dark in color. And in the upper right corner of the photo, near where a small landscape painting now hangs, the photo shows a specific symbol. A circle with lines radiating outward, like a misshapen, distorted star. My heart seemed to stop beating. My hands trembled. I slowly moved the landscape painting hanging on the wall aside. Immediately, my stomach dropped. Beneath the cream paint on the wall, faint grooves can be seen. They are not obvious at first, just shallow, barely noticeable indentations. But when I squinted and looked closer, raised my finger to touch, I could trace the outline of a certain drawing. My hands trembled as I felt those ridges under my fingertips. It matched the distorted star symbol in the old photo I was holding almost perfectly. The moment I realized that coincidence, a cold chill spread from my fingertips to my arm, then spread throughout my body, as if the cold was penetrating deep into my bones. My breath caught in my throat, and I staggered back, nearly dropping both the photo and the painting. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to leave this house immediately, find a motel, somewhere safe, anywhere to escape. But fear kept me immobilized in place, as if my feet were nailed to the floor. The door to the room behind me suddenly felt far away, and the space around me seemed to be shrinking, as if the walls were slowly pressing in. For a brief second, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room, the same corner where the faceless figure often stood in photographs. Just a fleeting movement, a fleeting shadow. But when I turned around quickly, there was nothing there. There was only darkness and heavy silence. That night I could hardly sleep at all. Every little creak in the house startled me awake, my heart beating wildly. My heart refused to settle into its normal rhythm, and the t-shirt I was wearing stuck to my back from cold sweat. The next day, my mind was in a fog of constant anxiety and lack of sleep. I found myself startled by every little sound. A dripping faucet in the kitchen, the rattling of the wind against the window, the steady hum of the refrigerator. The feeling of being watched became increasingly strong, almost tangible. I caught myself constantly glancing over my shoulder whenever I passed a mirror, half expecting, half terrified to see something standing right behind me. At one point, I tried to learn more about the house's past. I tried asking a local historian, then a few older neighbors. I just mentioned offhandedly that the house seemed to be quite old and had a basement full of strange objects. No one gave a clear explanation, just vague comments about the house having existed for a long time and having changed hands many times in the past. One person hinted that there had been rumors about this house, that it had once belonged to an eccentric, someone who often held strange, secret gatherings, although details were scarce and fuzzy. He merely acknowledged those rumors but avoided pressing them further, as if he didn't want to delve into an uncomfortable subject. Something about hearing these rumors from others, even hinted at, felt too close to scary confirmation, and I wasn't sure I really wanted that. Night after night, I dreamed of that faceless figure. Sometimes in my dreams, it stands right next to my bed, silent and motionless. Sometimes it floats close to the ceiling, its shadow covering me. And sometimes, it's simply waiting in the corner of a dark room. I rarely see it move in my dreams, but I can feel its presence intensifying, like a static charge building in the air before a thunderstorm. My heart beats so hard in these dreams that I often wake up gasping for air, my chest tight from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The fear was so palpable that even after I was fully awake, I still felt weighed down on the bed, as if invisible hands were holding me down. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. Being in the bedroom feels like being marinated in your own fear. Every passing moment in the dark night is a new trial of terror. My logic, worn as it was, told me that if I explored those symbols further, perhaps they would lose their haunting power over me. A fragile hope, but it's all I have. So I forced myself back into the basement again, forced myself to face that old wooden chest. I pulled out some older photos, placing them under the weak flickering light of the basement bulb. This time, I noticed a series of photos that seemed to show a progression. The first photos show the room is almost empty, save for the bed and the original faint outlines of the symbols on the wall. As the photos continue through time, the symbols become increasingly darker, bolder, and more complex. A disturbing transformation is taking place in that space. A progression from a vague haunting to something more concrete. And the faceless figure, which began to appear more clearly near the center of later photographs, was always tilted in a strange, unnatural pose. Occasionally, in a few blurry photos, it looked like there was more than one figure, but the images were too blurry to be certain. This time, when I rummaged deeper into the bottom of the box, I found something I had overlooked last time. A stack of handwritten notes, hidden beneath some photos. The writing is scribbled and jagged, as if the writer was in a hurry or in a state of great excitement. Most of the content is indecipherable, just fragmented, incomprehensible text. But a few phrases jumped off the page and caught my eye. Shadow upon shadow, viewer, can't sleep, circle of warning, the air tastes bitter. I read these words, and they felt like a direct reflection of my own current situation. My chest tightened. I realized that someone before me, perhaps the person who took these photos, had experienced the same fear, the same claustrophobic paranoia. Perhaps they were trying to resist whatever ghostly influence was embedded in these walls. Or perhaps they were the reason for its existence. I barely noticed the cold slowly creeping up my legs until I felt an unpleasant tingling sensation along my scalp. It was as if the temperature in the basement had suddenly plummeted in just a few short seconds. My breath caught in my throat again, and I felt my hands begin to shake uncontrollably. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I suddenly realized that I was holding my breath. In the almost absolute silence of the basement, I heard it, a very faint crunching sound. It came from the far end of the basement, hidden behind stacks of old, dusty cardboard boxes. Panic flared violently in my chest, and I could almost feel my heart twitching wildly in my rib cage. At first, I just slowly backed away step by step, my eyes never leaving the dark corner where the noise came from. Then, fear triumphed. I turned and rushed up the stairs, slamming and locking the basement door behind me. I collapsed onto the couch in the living room. My breathing was ragged, my body trembling non-stop. My hand twitched involuntarily, and my mind was spinning with thousands of unanswered questions. Am I imagining these chilling sounds and feelings? Was the constant stress and lack of sleep playing tricks on my mind? I tried to cling to reason. Maybe old pipes or shifting floorboards are causing the noise. Maybe I've become so nervous that every little sound feels like a potential threat. Yet a part of me, the part that had felt the cold, that had seen the symbols, remained convinced that something else, alive or at least active, existed in that house with me. That night was the worst night. A fierce thunderstorm descended on the town. Lightning struck continuously. White rays of light streaked across the night sky, passed through the window and made the shadows in my room dance and sway on the wall like living, strange shapes. The continuous rumble of thunder sounded like war drums, further increasing my already tense anxiety. I sat huddled on the bed in the bedroom, turned on all the lights, my eyes constantly roaming around, checking every nook and cranny, every dark corner, half expecting to see that faceless figure appear in a flash of lightning. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel each beat like a hard punch to my chest. Every muscle in my body tensed to the point of pain. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I didn't dare close them, not even for a second. Sometimes, around after midnight, amid the rumbles of thunder, I feel a strange gravitational force pulling my attention toward the corner of the room, the very corner where in the photos, that faceless figure often stands. The air in that corner seemed thicker, like passing through an invisible spider web. I noticed the floorboards there were a bit uneven, raised a bit, and there was a strong, almost uncontrollable urge to use a small knife to pry up a board. Beneath that panel, I found a small secret compartment, cut into the floor. Inside was an old notebook, with a worn cloth cover and tied together with fragile threads. The pages inside are covered with cryptic symbols, similar to those on the wall in the photos. The last pages of the notebook showed frantic, scribbled drawings, forming a crude circle, a circle exactly like the distorted star-shaped symbol I had seen hidden behind the landscape painting. And then, written with a trembling hand, pressing so hard that it almost tore the fragile paper, were the words. Could be a plea or a warning. They read, "It is trapped, but not contained. Don't erase the trace." A chill ran through my entire body, and my mouth was so dry that I could barely swallow. I realized that the landscape painting I hung up had accidentally hidden part of this important symbol, as if someone had previously tried to keep it sealed, or at least not clearly visible. Perhaps the very act of discovering it, touching it, acknowledging its existence by moving the painting, somehow increased its influence, awakened it. My mind raced with conflicting and chaotic thoughts. But one thing flashed with certainty. I had to put that painting back in place immediately, had to restore anything that could act as a barrier, however temporary. I tremblingly placed the notebook back in the secret floor recess, slammed the wooden plank down into place, and hastily hung the landscape painting back where it had been, completely covering up the terrifying symbol on the wall. All the while, my heart was pounding madly in my chest. My hands were so cold and shaking that I almost dropped the small hammer I used to hammer the board together. The air in the room felt charged, like the heavy air just before a big storm. Once the painting was safely rehung, covering the symbol once more, I felt an invisible pressure that seemed to subtly ease, as if some tension in the air had been somewhat loosened. I stood there, still shaking, not knowing whether I was fighting a real supernatural entity or just a figment of my own fraying imagination. That night, I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle in my body protesting against constant vigilance. As the first rays of the new day shone through, bringing with it pale daylight and a sense of relative peace, I made my final decision. I quickly packed the most necessary things: clothes, toiletries, and the wooden chest containing those ghostly photos. I can't stay in this house another night. Whether that threat was real or just the product of my own worsening paranoia, I could not continue to live on the brink of this terror. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a gaunt face, sunken eyes, hair matted with sweat, and a jaw clenched with determination. This is not who I want to be. As I drove away, the house loomed in the rearview mirror, its dark windows like lifeless, incomprehensible eyes. Even when I reached the street, I could still feel it clinging to me, like an invisible string. My heart was still pounding in my chest as I turned the corner, causing the house to disappear from sight. A hoarse, heavy breath escaped my chest, as if I had been holding it for days. Yet as I drove further and further from there, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was carrying something with me. Not just haunting memories, but something more tangible. A curse, a mental scar left by unrelenting fear, or perhaps the presence itself. Part of me wondered if I could truly escape the feeling of being watched. Even though I found another place to live, a completely strange place, the image of that faceless figure and those strange symbols still followed me into every silence, every dark corner. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, when only the faint light of a streetlight entered the room, I thought I felt a presence standing right behind the weak light of the night lamp. My pulse pounded again. Cold sweat poured out again, drenching my shirt as I nervously glanced around, half expecting to see that figure hiding in the darkness of an unfamiliar corner of the room. Even in a completely different context, fear still exists, still clings. I still have the trunk containing those photos, which is now locked and stored in the archives. But the mere awareness of its existence weighed heavily on my mind. The feeling of impending danger, of something inexplicable, remained, hanging like a dark cloud. No matter how many times I told myself that it was over, that I was safe, I could never fully convince myself. That house, those symbols, and that faceless shape were ingrained in my soul, leaving an indelible mark. I still wonder if my experiences were real, or if I was simply slowly unraveling, crumbling under the weight of my own anxieties and fears. Yet every time my skin gets goosebumps from a random noise in the night, every time I wake up startled from a nightmare drenched in cold sweat, I remember that there are horrors that go beyond common understanding, and that they leave an indelible mark. Sometimes the most unsettling thing isn't the haunted house, but the idea that whatever we fear most can follow us anywhere. And perhaps, it's been with us from the beginning. The escape from the house of photographs did not bring the peace I expected. The fear, the feeling of being watched, it seemed to have taken root in me, becoming an uninvited companion. I moved into a new place, a small house I bought, hoping that having my own space would provide a sense of security and control. But that illusion quickly shattered. I still remember that morning, when it all started again. I woke up with the same vague, oppressive feeling of unease that had disturbed my sleep all night. The air in my bedroom felt heavier than usual, almost breathless, and my heart was pounding in my chest like a frantically beaten drum. Even before my feet touched the cold floor, I knew something was wrong. The usual silence that had filled the house in the early hours of that morning felt different. It was not quiet, but seemed alive, bustling with an invisible tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, watching and waiting for something to happen. My mouth was dry, and my skin was clammy with cold sweat even though it wasn't hot. From the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow moving quickly down the hallway just outside my door. But when I turned my head to look, there was only the dim morning light shining in from the window at the end of the hallway. That's how my fateful morning began, engulfed in a suffocating fear that I couldn't name, couldn't define. I've always been an early riser. I love the moment of dawn, when the first rays of sunlight begin to paint the sky with warm oranges and vibrant reds. There is something incredibly peaceful about welcoming a new day before the rest of the world wakes up. My house is located on a fairly large plot of land, surrounded by a green lawn stretching on 3 sides. At dawn, the blades of grass often sparkle with lingering night dew drops, and when the sunlight shines at the right angle, the whole lawn looks like it is strewn with tiny crystals. Usually, stepping out onto the porch early in the morning gives me a sense of comfort and calm. The crisp scent of wet grass, the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze, those small joys always help me maintain peace in my soul, dispelling remaining obsessions. But on this particular morning, instead of the usual stillness, I felt a rising sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Ignoring the unusual pounding of my heart in my chest, I decided to do what I usually do every day. Open the front door, step out onto the porch and take in the rising sunrise. I gently pushed the front door open, expecting to feel the cool morning breeze on my face and hear the distant chirping of the first birds waking up. Instead, a heavy, almost deathly silence enveloped me the moment I crossed the threshold. The air was stuffy and still. Not a single breeze stirred the trees in the garden. And worse yet, something was very wrong under my bare feet. The grass is usually soft and wet at this hour, but when I step off the porch, it sinks under my weight in strange, uneven patches. My heart rate skyrocketed, and a drop of cold sweat began to trickle down my temple. I lowered my head and glanced down, and my heart stopped beating. There were deep footprints imprinted on the frost-covered ground. And they don't belong to me. My logical mind struggled, searching for a reasonable explanation. Perhaps some large animal roamed the yard at night? Or maybe it was just a trick of the weak morning light. But these footprints were too large, too deep, and too clear to be from a common animal. Each mark in the grass goes much deeper than a normal human step. And they were eerily evenly spaced, almost perfectly spaced, as if whatever had created them had taken carefully measured, deliberate steps. I bent down to get a better look, and I noticed that the blades of grass at the edge of the footprints were bent sideways, as if an enormous weight had been placed on them. The pattern of these footprints led from the far corner of the yard, where darkness remained, toward the side of the house, where the shadows of the trees still stretched in the weak morning light. That image suddenly appeared in my mind. A tall, invisible figure, striding gracefully across my property, toward that dark corner as if it belonged there. The shock of discovering these mysterious footprints sparked a feeling of extreme tension and anxiety in my stomach. I felt cool sweat running down my forehead. My breathing became shallower and faster. For a moment, I considered calling someone, maybe a friend, or a neighbor, or even the police. But the idea of having to explain this bizarre situation seemed absurd. Strange footprints in the grass, no indication of who or what made them, and a creepily persistent feeling of being watched. They will definitely think I'm crazy. Instead, I tried to calm myself. I took a few slow, deep breaths and tried to explain the situation logically. After all, it could have just been some intruder who had wandered into my yard during the night, perhaps a wanderer looking for a place to sleep, or someone looking for shelter. A cold thought, but at least it's an explanation grounded in reality, not an invisible phantom. I carefully followed the footprints until they disappeared into a dark space near the fence at the end of the yard. A cluster of luxuriant bushes and an old oak tree turned that corner of the yard into a place that was almost always in shadow, even during the day. And there, the air felt strangely cold. Even though the morning sun was slowly climbing high in the sky, the hair on the back of my neck stood up again. I tried to peer through the bushes, but saw only deeper, motionless shadows. My skin was covered in goosebumps, and I felt a strong urge to return to the porch immediately. Once back on the porch, I forced myself to methodically scan the yard. Aside from those strange footprints, nothing else seemed to be disturbed. The door was still locked, with no signs of being forced open. However, I couldn't shake the feeling of invisible eyes watching my every move. By the next day, I had almost convinced myself that it was an isolated, one-time event. Maybe someone actually walked through my yard during the night and I overreacted. I woke up, still determined to perform my sunrise ritual, but the tightness in my chest with anxiety showed that I was not as calm as I was trying to pretend. When I stood up, the floorboards in my bedroom creaked under my weight again, and the sharp memory of the deep footprints appeared clearly in my mind. My mouth was dry again, but I forced myself to continue my morning routine as usual. I remember thinking that perhaps normalcy was the best antidote to the paranoia that was gradually taking over me. However, just as I opened the front door a crack that Monday morning, I heard it. There was a distinct thudding sound, almost like heavy boots stomping on wet grass. My heart seemed to skip a beat. That sound didn't come from far away, but right nearby, right in my yard. Each step sounded steady, deliberate, echoing in the silence that enveloped the house in the early morning. The rhythmic crunch of crushed grass underfoot sounded noisier than usual, as if something very heavy was moving. The air around me seemed electrically charged again, like it was preparing for a fierce storm. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely think clearly. When the footsteps suddenly stopped, my breath caught in my throat. I hesitantly stepped forward, cautiously looking around the yard. But just like yesterday, I didn't see anyone or anything. There were only footprints identical to the previous day, imprinted on the layer of morning dew. Except this time, they not only led to the dark corner, but also crawled around the side of the house. I walked closer and saw more footprints. They walked around the perimeter of the house, and the scariest thing was, they stopped right near each window, as if something had stopped there right next to the wall to look inside. That image appeared in my head and made me shiver, a feeling of being violated and watched nakedly. The desire to feel safe, even if it was just an illusion, motivated me to take action. I called a local electronics store to ask about security camera installation. Instead of explaining in detail the bizarre events that were taking place, I simply said that I needed a system that could record every movement around my house, especially at night. Later that day, I installed the cameras myself, placing them strategically around the porch, in the corners of the house, and one in particular pointed directly toward a mysterious dark corner in the yard. I felt a temporary relief, believing that if those footsteps returned, I would at least have solid evidence of what was happening. At least I could catch a glimpse of that invisible intruder. Nightfall brought with it an oppressive tension I had never felt before in this house. Every little creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside the window, makes my heart beat a beat faster. I tried to distract myself by turning the TV up louder than usual, but it only made me more restless and alert. I imagined I could hear faint crunching sounds, very soft, right near the window, and every time I paused the program I was watching to listen, my heart pounded in my chest, my mouth dry with fear. When I checked the video feed from the app on my phone, everything was normal, just dark, still images of the garden at night. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that lack of sleep and anxiety were making me hear things that weren't true. But then, at dawn the next day, when that heavy silence enveloped the house again, I heard them again. Slow, deliberate footsteps were crushing the grass just outside. My throat tightened, sweat broke out on my palms, and I found myself shaking uncontrollably. I quickly rushed over and grabbed my phone to check the live feed from the camera. But the app just displays a cold error message, unable to connect to device. It was as if all the cameras simultaneously lost power or signal at that exact moment. My stomach tightened with fear and frustration. I rushed to the nearest window, my trembling fingers pushed the curtain aside, and looked out. The grass on the field is moving. It wasn't the wind, because the air remained eerily still. It was slow, rippling ripples on the surface of the grass, as if something large, invisible, was gliding across it. But I didn't see a single shadow. I gasped as a new set of footprints suddenly appeared in the thin layer of mist. One by one, footprints formed right before my eyes, one after another, circling the house. I couldn't take my eyes off that strange scene. It was as if an invisible presence was lurking around my house, step by step, assessing each entry point, each window. The moment the last footsteps receded and disappeared, the camera feed on my phone flickered back to normal, showing an image of the garden as still as if nothing had happened. I felt my fear turn into a nauseating frustration. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to have gotten past my rudimentary defenses with ease, as if mocking my feeble attempts to understand it. That night, I called a close friend who lived a few miles away. I tried to explain the strange things that were happening. The mysterious footprints in the yard, the inexplicably malfunctioning cameras, the constant feeling of being watched. I remember him laughing nervously on the phone, telling me that maybe I was just too tired or stressed. He suggested I rest, maybe go somewhere for a few days, see if the problem goes away on its own. Deep inside, I almost wanted to believe what he said. However, the sinking, heavy feeling in my gut whispered that this phenomenon would not go away just because I chose to ignore it. The next morning, my body was as tense as an overstretched guitar string. I woke up from a restless sleep, drenched in sweat and my heart pounding in alarm again. Even the simple act of drawing the window curtain makes my fingers tremble. This time, when I looked outside, footprints were everywhere. They didn't just circle around, but looped around the house many times, overlapping each other, crossing themselves, as if something had spent the entire night circling, endlessly circling the house, like a caged animal frantically searching for an escape, or a predator tightening its grip. The blood in my body felt cold. The house suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic, like a cage slowly closing in. My breathing became ragged, and every muscle in my body tensed with alarm. Now there is no more doubt. Something was hunting me, or at least, studying me obsessively. Determined not to become a prisoner in my own home, I ventured out around noon. The bright sunlight had dispelled most of the darkness in the garden, and I hoped that perhaps the light of day would weaken the power this invisible presence held. As I stepped onto the porch, my vision suddenly wavered for a moment. The air in front of me seemed to ripple, creating a heat mirage-like effect at the edge of the field. A sudden wave of dizziness hit me, forcing me to hold tightly to the porch railing to keep my balance. My heart was beating so violently that I was afraid I might faint. As I closed my eyes for a moment to regain my composure, a cold, icy wind blew past my face, sending shivers down my spine despite the warm sunlight shining down. For a brief moment, I thought I heard deep, hoarse breathing right behind me. A slow, heavy rhythm, almost that of a lurking predator. But when I turned around quickly, there was nothing there. There was only empty space and bright sunlight. That night I couldn't sleep. My bed offered no comfort, and the darkness in my house seemed alive with an invisible threat. Every slightest shift of the floorboards, every squeak of the furniture, made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest as if it wanted to escape my rib cage. Around 3 a.m., when the silence was at its heaviest, I heard a soft click at the back door. That was no ordinary knock on the door. It was like an experiment, a groping, like something was sliding a rough, hard surface across the wood of the door. Light, steady scratching sound. My throat tightened painfully. I forced myself out of bed, turned on every light in the house for which I could find a switch, and slowly, cautiously crawled toward the noise coming from the back door. The scratching continued, slow, deliberate, and unhurried. My breathing became so loud that it drowned out almost everything else in the tense silence. When I finally reached the back door, I shakily pressed my eyes to the peephole. At first, all I saw was the thick darkness of the night outside. Then there was a movement, a subtle change in the darkness right before my eyes. Cold sweat ran down my face, and I felt my heartbeat skip a few beats. There was nothing recognizable, no human figures, no particular animal shapes at all. Just a faint impression of space being twisted and bent right in front of the viewport, as if reality itself was being distorted by an invisible force. I went back to the camera screen on my phone, and of course they were offline again. Each new wave of fear made me break out in a cold sweat. My limbs were shaking, my palms were cold, and my mouth was as dry as the desert. In that moment, I felt like the whole house was pressing in on me from all sides. I could actually feel the walls shrinking, pressing tighter, until my breathing became weak, labored. I gasped, starting to doubt my own sanity. Maybe I'm actually hallucinating? Or maybe the extreme stress caused some form of paranoid delusion. Yet the physical evidence was still there. Footprints in the grass, systematically malfunctioning cameras, inexplicable sounds. It all told me that this was more than just my mind unraveling. I spent the next day in a state of blind panic, my senses on high alert for every slightest movement, every flashing light, every suspicious noise. It was as if part of my brain had automatically switched to constantly scanning my surroundings for threats, like a cornered animal. My paranoia increased to the point where I couldn't even believe my own reflection in the mirror. Several times I caught a glimpse of myself, only to feel an electric shock of fear, half expecting to see something else looking back at me from the mirror. The lawn, which had once been my morning comfort, now seemed like a field full of hidden possibilities, where each blade of grass seemed to hide some invisible threat. As the sun set again, signaling a long night ahead, I decided I couldn't just endure it passively. I locked every door, secured every window, and equipped myself with a high-powered flashlight, the type used by police. I hoped that facing this presence directly, under a powerful beam of light, might remove some of its mystery and fear. The moment complete darkness engulfed me. I stood by the window looking out at the front yard, my heart pounding violently in my chest, and each breath felt like I was inhaling sharp razor blades. Time seemed to last forever, each minute passing like a nerve-wracking marathon. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the house suddenly became strangely eerie. So quiet it's creepy. Even the familiar hum of the refrigerator seems to have disappeared. My heartbeat roared in my ears, and I braced myself, waiting for the familiar sounds of footsteps. They came, slowly and deliberately as always, the sound of grass being crushed echoing in the same steady rhythm that I had begun to fear. This time I didn't run away. I secretly opened the front door and shined a powerful flashlight beam straight into the darkness outside. For a brief split second I thought I saw it. A deformed shape, blurred in the air, like heat waves rising from the asphalt on a hot summer day. It had no discernible shape, but it was moving, gliding, but not in a way that any normal creature would. My body froze in place, my heart pounding so violently that I could feel it shaking my entire body. I tried to hold the flashlight tightly in my hand. My palm was sweaty, making it slippery. The distorted figure drifted toward the side of the house, then disappeared into deeper darkness, where the flashlight couldn't reach. But the footsteps continued, circling around me, around the house, but I could no longer determine their exact origin. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and a wave of dizziness and nausea nearly made me drop the flashlight and collapse. I don't know how long I stood there, motionless in the doorway, flashlight in hand scanning aimlessly back and forth into the darkness, seeing only flickering, indistinct movements at the edges of my vision. Finally, the footsteps faded, then fell silent. Slowly, the normal nighttime sounds began to return. The chirping of crickets in the grass, the distant rustling of the wind in the treetops. My body felt completely exhausted, as if I had just gone through a life-or-death battle. Every muscle trembled with extreme tension and terror. My clothes were drenched in cold sweat, and I realized I was clenching my teeth so hard that my jaw ached. Awkwardly returning inside the house, I did not feel relieved at all. There was just a haunting, heavy awareness that something had tested my limits, had shown me its power, and had deliberately left me alive with the knowledge that it could do so again, whenever it wanted. I collapsed onto the living room chair, flashlight still clutched in my shaking hand, and tried to catch my breath. It was the first time I actually admitted to myself that this thing, whatever it was, clearly had the upper hand. When morning came, I felt like I had aged 10 years overnight. My face in the mirror appeared pale, haggard, and tense like I had never seen before. Footprints were scattered all over the field again, as I had predicted. But this time there is a new, even scarier detail. In some places, the footprints seemed to form strange symbols, almost like ancient patterns or runes carved into the grass. A nauseating fear made my stomach churn at the thought that this entity might be marking its territory, or worse, sending some message I couldn't understand. I suddenly realized, in a cold shock, that I needed to leave. Right away. Maybe not forever, but at least gone long enough to gather my emotional and intellectual fragments, and to see if the distance brings me any peace, even if only temporarily. I hastily threw some essentials into a travel bag. My hands were shaking so much that it took me twice as long as usual to do something as simple as folding clothes. As I walked to my car parked in the yard, each step felt like I was wading through knee-deep water, heavy and difficult. My vision seemed to narrow, the edges of my vision blurred. I half expected to feel a cold, heavy hand on my shoulder, or to see new footprints forming right behind me in the grass. But the field remained artificially silent, bathed in the morning sunlight. The moment I sat in the driver's seat, I immediately locked all the car doors and glanced around nervously, expecting some final confrontation. However, the house and garden looked completely empty and normal in the morning sunlight, except for strange, deep indentations in the lawn. With the engine running, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart was still pounding violently in my chest, a steady reminder of the fear still coursing through my veins. I didn't feel victorious or relieved. There is only lingering, persistent fear. There's something out there, and it's not limited by walls or doors. It studied me, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. As I drove away from the house, I briefly glanced toward the dark corner of the yard in the rearview mirror. The shadow there seemed almost to pulsate, like a living creature hiding. Even though I was driving away, no sense of relief came over me. Instead, a new horror rose from the depths. I was leaving the house, but under the watchful eye of something that could follow me anywhere. Even when I reached the open road, I felt its presence clinging to me like a layer of cold sweat that wouldn't dry. A certain, oppressive feeling weighed upon me that this was far from over. I'm running away, yes, but I'm not escaping. The morning sun brought no warmth, only harsh light, accentuating every nervous tremble in my body and every question gnawing at my soul. Had I really seen something unexplainable? Or has my mind turned mundane events into a living nightmare? And would I dare go back? When I finally turned onto the main highway, the house receded behind me, just a speck of dust in the rearview mirror. However, the tension in my chest refused to ease. I found myself constantly glancing into the rearview mirrors, half expecting to see a shimmer, a distortion in the air following closely behind my car. Every shadow of a tree passing by on the road made my heart rate skyrocket. My mouth is still dry, my breathing is still shallow. Although I felt momentarily safer surrounded by metal and speed, I couldn't shake the feeling that my ordeal had only just begun. that somehow I always carry a part of that nightmare with me wherever I go. Now, as I am recounting these lines to you, from a temporary residence, a temporary borrowed place, I am still haunted by the memory of the footprints in the morning dew. The rational part of my mind kept trying to write off this horrifying experience as just a series of strange, random coincidences. But my body still remembers that paralyzing fear. My heart still beats faster every time there is a vague reminder of those carefully measured steps, or distorted shapes glimpsed at the edges of my vision. I survived that ordeal, but I can't say I escaped it completely. There was a lingering haunting, a ghostly presence in my thoughts, a cold, spectral feeling that could invade me without warning. Even here, in this strange room, I sometimes unconsciously look down at the floor, half expecting to see mysterious footprints forming out of thin air. Whatever I encountered in that house, it shattered the fragile illusion of security I had tried to build around my life. I was left with an unshakable feeling of being watched, a constant itching at the back of my neck, as if some invisible eyes were still watching me from afar. Even though I drove hundreds of miles away from that house, the claustrophobia still lingered in my mind like a layer of dirt that wouldn't wash away. My freedom felt empty, overshadowed by the awareness that there was something out there, challenging my understanding of reality. And on late, lonely nights, I lay awake in bed, imagining those slow, steady steps circling this new house, passing through every window in my soul, until there was nowhere left for me to run to anymore. After consecutive escapes, I felt exhausted both physically and mentally. I needed a change, something to keep my mind occupied, to pull me out of the spiral of fear and paranoia. That's why I decided to volunteer at the city's ancient library. A place of knowledge, silence, and old stories. I hoped it would be an antidote to my tormented soul. But sometimes, the most ancient places hide the deepest and scariest secrets. I still remember the first time I walked into that library building. A pale ray of light filtered through the stained glass windows high in the ceiling, creating strange, twisted shadows that danced across the old, worn wooden floor. My heartbeat, already unstable, seemed to echo off the cold stone walls, as if the library's ancient architecture itself recognized my hidden anxiety. My breathing became shallower and faster as I entered the vast main hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something much older than the dusty stacks of books, something ancient and invisible, watching my every step. From the beginning, there was an underlying fear in the air, like an invisible hand gently pressing on my spine. It tightened my chest and made every movement feel like I was intruding on a sacred place, a place that belonged to something else, something that didn't want to be disturbed. I volunteered there to help with the restoration of old books, precious documents that had been untouched for decades. The library building is at least 100 years old, although some locals whisper that parts of the foundation, the vaults deep below, date back even further from a forgotten era. I've never found any official records confirming it, but sometimes as I wander the deserted corridors, I've noticed strange architectural details, stone slabs carved in a style that seems out of place in the last century, like remnants from a much more distant and mysterious age. My task was relatively simple in theory. Sort through old documents on yellowed paper cards, repair worn volumes, reinforce peeling spines, and carefully remove the thick layer of dust that had accumulated over the centuries. Initially, this idea really excited me. I have always loved history, and touching ancient texts is like looking through a window in time, into the thoughts and lives of people who lived long ago. However, from the first week of working there, something in the silent hallways, in the rows of towering bookshelves, began to worry me. During the day, when the library is open to visitors, this place is simply quiet, like a solemn cathedral of knowledge. Sunlight shines through the stained glass windows, painting the oak reading tables with shimmering colors that change every hour. The silence is only occasionally broken by the gentle rustle of a pencil on paper, or the sparse footsteps of a rare visitor who wanders into the antique books area. But after the sun sank below the horizon, when the last employees had left and I was alone in the vast building, a tangible, oppressive chill crept into every corner. Only a few overhead lights were turned on, casting weak, dim lights down the aisles, making everything look dim and unnatural. and the shadows between the bookshelves seemed to grow thicker and deeper, almost as if they had weight and were slowly swallowing up the faint light that remained. Every step I took into those dark hallways at night felt like I was entering a place where my presence was not welcome, a place where I was just an intruder. The head librarian, an older man with a stern expression and deep eyes, told me from the very beginning that I was free to stay outside of business hours if I wanted a very quiet environment for my meticulous restoration work. He mentioned in passing that there was no one else around at the time, so I could completely focus on my work. I recall him adding, in a low and somewhat hesitant voice, that I should be careful not to strain my eyes in the dim light of the library at night. He didn't say much more, just said I could find him the next morning if I needed anything. I merely nodded in agreement, but there was an unmistakable tension in the way he spoke, in the quick glances in his eyes toward the dark hallways, as if he were politely warning me about something that was best left unsaid. At first, I tried to put that vague caution aside. The first few nights passed without anything unusual happening, except for an odd creak or two from the old wooden beams above the soaring ceiling. I assumed it was just the normal noise of an old building settling with temperature changes during the night. But then the whispers started. At first, it was just a vague, very light rustling sound, right at the edge of my hearing, too faint to determine exactly what it was or where it came from. I would often look up from the work I was doing, certain that I had just heard a faint voice right behind me. But when I turned around, I saw nothing but the tall, motionless shapes of giant bookshelves engulfed in darkness. My heart beat a little faster, but I forced myself to brush it away, telling myself that it could just be the sound of the wind rushing through the cracks in the ancient stone wall, or maybe it was just my own oversensitive imagination, influenced by the previous stories. However, the next night I noticed those whispers again. This time, they seemed a little louder, a little clearer, like a soft, ghostly chorus of voices whispering to each other, drifting down from the shelves higher above the balcony. I tried again to tell myself that it could just be noise from the building's old ventilation system, or the sound of water flowing in ancient pipes. This time, however, I couldn't ignore the chill running down my spine. My hands began to tremble slightly as I turned the fragile pages of the ancient book under repair, and I find myself glancing over my shoulder far more often than I'd like to admit. Sometimes, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, a distinct feeling as if I'm being watched by someone, or something, from the darkness between the rows of bookshelves. I tried my best to push this growing discomfort away. Anyway, I have work to do, and I am proud of my carefulness and meticulousness when mending each fragile page, rescuing forgotten knowledge. But the more I immersed myself in the heavy silence of the library at night, the stronger and more oppressive the atmosphere seemed to become. I started catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, just a quick shadow across the upstairs balcony, or an inexplicable change in light at the end of a long hallway. Then there were times when a strange, sudden cold feeling swept over me while I was bent over my desk. It's not like the normal cold of an old, dilapidated building at night. It was sharper, more invasive, almost malevolent, and it gave me goosebumps that lingered long after the cold feeling was gone. One particular evening, while I was rearranging a pile of old books and magazines on a cart, I thought I saw a shape near the end of the hallway where I was standing. It was tall and narrow, almost just a vertical line of black darker than the surrounding darkness. But before I could squint to see clearly, before my mind could figure out what it was, the single fluorescent light on the ceiling of that hallway suddenly flickered violently, then went out, plunging everything into almost absolute darkness,